Thanks so much, Rosario and Vincent, for your really important remarks. And I'm super excited to welcome today Emma Vadehra of Next 100 and Cheryl Dorsey from Echoing Green. Thanks so much for being here, ladies.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here with you all.
So we just heard remarks from those two outstanding leaders about the way their lived experiences have informed the work that they're leading in their communities. Emma, as the executive director of Next 100, where Rosario is a policy entrepreneur, and Cheryl as president of Echoing Green, where Vincent was an Echoing Green Black Male Achievement Fellow, can you share reflections about their remarks and how they relate to the broader mission of your two organizations?
Sure. So first of all, it's nice to be here with the two of you, and privileged to be invited, so thank you. As I said, I'm the executive director of Next 100, which among other things means I get to be Rosario's colleague. What's Next 100? It is a secret plan to get more Rosarios driving public policy inside and outside of government. We are part Policy Leadership Development Program, investing in a new set of policy leaders who bring proximity and lived experience to their work. And we're part mini think tank that empowers these leaders to drive their own work with communities and without a predetermined agenda. So we believe that public policy matters deeply. We believe everything's a policy choice, whether we acknowledge that or not. From our inability to respond to COVID, to its disproportionate impact on communities of color, to Black maternal mortality rates, to the fact that some of our fellow New Yorkers don't currently have internet or a device to watch this panel, and some of us do. It's all a policy choice. The systemic challenges we face, like economic inequality, need systemic solutions. They are massive. They have to be met in part by the scale of government, but the scale of government has to be matched by the effectiveness of government, the responsiveness of government, and its connection to the communities it's supporting. And too often that's not what we're actually seeing happen. We see people driving these massive decisions who are disconnected from the daily experiences of those they're trying to help. And at Next 100, we want to change that by investing in people like Rosario, supporting them to drive their work hand in hand with communities. We just launched 2 years ago, so we are new. We are a baby or a toddler. We have recruited a tremendous set of folks like Rosario who bring lived experience and proximity to communities. We work on education, immigration, criminal justice, labor. We work at the federal level. We work at the state level in New York State and Oklahoma. We work at the city level in New York City, greatest city on earth. And the work you heard Rosario talk a little bit about and her experience is a lot of the work we're incredibly proud to support. Rosario is a former educator. She's an immigrant. She is a former DACA recipient, and she has focused her policy work on issues at the intersection of children and immigration. The project she talked about a little bit basically focuses on how states can support immigrant families, even as we work for federal immigration reform. She both did a 50-state policy analysis, but also deeply talked to immigrant families around their vision, their priorities, and their ideas for solutions. And that's the kind of work we are excited to do and do more of. People like Rosario drive the work. Our job is to support them and many more like them.
Cheryl, how does this show up at Echoing Green?
Absolutely. And I think it's very important that we're raising up young leaders and young voices of color like Rosario and Vince, right? This is a really essential activity for all of us to do who are in the social impact space. And I had the wonderful pleasure of hanging out with Vince and Rashid virtually this past weekend at their Good Troublemakers think tank, where they brought together many of the young men of color that they're working with in their effort to advance the recruitment, development, and retention of Black male educators in partnership with school districts, right? It gets to the basic fundamental point that representation matters. And it matters for a whole host of reasons, but I'll highlight 3 in the context of this conversation. I think increasingly more of us, not necessarily 3 of us, because I think we do this work because we understand it, that our efforts to advance social change in this country are inextricably linked and rooted in race, right? I mean, it's just so clear and essential and fundamental. So understanding the role of race and the problems that we're all trying to solve leads you directly to leaders like Rosario and Vince, right? This understanding that many of these leaders bring strategies that are intimately tied to their understanding of the racialized experiences of communities of color and the issues that the communities that they're working with face. So they have got to be in the room. They've got to have a seat at the table. And over the longer term, it allows them as leaders of color to not only build power for themselves as a leadership voice in the communities they serve, but also fundamentally starting to shift the narrative around what leadership looks like, what it needs to look like in an inclusive society, and the difference that that kind of representation and inclusion needs to look like to drive the change that we're all committed to.
So I think this centering these lived experiences is the theme that we're going to talk about throughout our time together. So let's start with each of you. How have your own personal and professional experiences shaped how you approach your work?
Should I jump in?
Sure.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my professional experiences because it's deeply shaped the way we think about the work at Next 100. I worked, as you know, Kyle, at the federal level for over a decade. I worked as a senior staffer for the late Senator Ted Kennedy. I worked in the U.S. Department of Education, Chief of Staff to Secretary Arne Duncan and John King. I got to be in the room where it happens. I got to see how policy is developed. I got to see how the fault lines are drawn, how the political battles are won, who gets to make decisions, who gets to engage, what expertise counts. Cheryl talked a little bit about what leadership looks like, but a lot of what we think about is what expertise counts and what expertise is valued. Say from all of that, I was regularly surprised by the power of government for good and bad. I was regularly surprised by the power of the bully pulpit, by the power of that amount of money, by the power of immense legal authority and small changes that can make a huge difference. But I was also just struck over and over again by who's actually paying attention to all of that, right? Who gets to engage? It's professional stakeholders, it's advocates, it's membership organizations, who gets to make decisions, the power of the unelected members of government, bureaucrats like me who work behind the scenes, making a lot of decisions every day that nobody has any transparency around. Lack of diversity in government and in a lot of policy organizations. You know, the Joint Center in DC has done some great work, most recently finding that 40% of Americans are people of color, but 11% of senior Senate staffers are people of color. And that disparity is actually sort of exists up and down government in every branch, right? And you see a lot of well-intentioned people as policymakers, as advocates, few of whom have actually lived the challenges they're looking to address. You see people who get paid to be stakeholders, not people who are living the life every day. You see the opaque processes that, you know, if you know, that professional people know how to make change in government. They get paid a lot by big corporations to know how to make change in government, and it's really hard to break into that space. And so that is a lot of what we're trying to take on at Next 100 and trying to shape. We think if we have different people doing this work inside and outside of government, we'll just be starting from a far stronger place.
Cheryl, we often say to people who are closest to the problem usually have the best solutions. And I think your emergence from an Echoing Green Fellow to leading the organization is a tremendous example of that. Tell us a little bit more.
No, thank you for that question, and appreciate us not just sort of sticking to sort of the work, but sort of interrogating the stories that lead us. What are our moments of obligation that get us into this work? And I think for me, I'm going to answer that, Kaya, at three levels, sort of the personal, the professional, and then the structural. I'm a little Black girl who grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, the daughter of two public school teachers. My mom was the second person in her family to go to college. My dad was the first person in his family to go to college, both proud graduates of an HBCU, Morgan State University. But, you know, as an African-American in this country, I'm sure like a lot of folks, I spent my early years trying to understand why I didn't matter, right? I heard that messaging constantly. It was sort of the tension and the clash of both our founding ideals, but also sort of the vicious cycle of white supremacy that tried to denigrate a whole class of folks and prevent them from full citizenship, folks that look like you and I, right? Everything from being a student of history to see someone I admired greatly, Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American woman in this country to produce a book of poetry as a formerly enslaved person who got dragged by Thomas Jefferson in his 1785 tome, Note from the State of Virginia, right? There's something wrong with that sort of clash and power imbalance, but it said something very powerful that this man, the Secretary of State, this gentleman farmer, this president had to go after a woman of color of lowly means. It said something about the fear that we inspired simply by what we look like, right? So that sort of interrogation continued across my career, everything from working on a seminal study on caste, where all sort of have read Isabel Wilkerson, but back in the day in the 80s, after Gunnar Myrdal's seminal work in American Dilemma, I worked as a young research assistant on a study on the status of African Americans from World War II to the present, looking at how we had fared and where the challenges and opportunities remain. So understanding sort of the role of racial disparities, racial inequities, structural racism, that directly led me to Echoing Green when, as a medical student, I was working in Boston watching Black babies die at 3 times the rate of white babies, and asking, what is my role and responsibility to do something about that disparity? Was fortunate enough to be invested in as a young leader of color by Echoing Green and recognize what it felt like to be centered by an organization like Echoing Green, to trust me, to believe in me, and to put me first, right? Sort of a seeding of power that we never see enough of. And I appreciated that and was grateful for that experience, so much so that I now run the organization and have been at the work for the past 20 years to get extraordinary leaders who look like you two, who are doing the work like you two, to get more of us across the transom and onto the playing field to do more of it. And the last thing I will say is change is hard. It's hard for people to change. It's hard for systems to change. So recognizing the role of social innovation, which is a strategy for driving social and environmental change more quickly and at scale, was an approach to transformational scale that really resonated to me, seeing more leaders like Vince and Rashid from Summer House Institute getting into the mix and trying to dedicate my life to making social innovation a tried and true methodology for transformation that stands alongside rights-based movements, community organizing, advocacy work that folks like you all are doing, and just allowing us to have more arrows in the quiver, because we all have a lot of work to do, especially in this moment.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. So as we all know, 2020 was a moment. It was a moment where the disparities and the inequities in our economic systems, our healthcare systems, our justice systems were not just exposed, but also exacerbated by all kinds of things: global pandemic, racial reckoning, whatever. What has 2020 meant for Next 100 and Echoing Green? Cheryl, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I mean, it's sort of, we've all heard sort of the phrase, which is so true, that we all lived through sort of the twin pandemics of structural racism and COVID-19, a global health pandemic that did nothing more than sort of unearth and make visible for many for the first time what structural racism looks like, right? And how communities of color are disproportionately impacted by so many things. For Echoing Green, it was a moment to raise our hand, right? Again, you know, this is an organization run by a woman of color. And for many years, we had been sort of privileging and raising up leaders of color. If you look over the past decade in particular, 75% of our folks are people of color, 75% of them globally are proximate, about 50% women. So we understand the power of investing and representing voices of color in the fight. And we recognize that as tied as we are to the movement of social innovation, it did not have an explicit focus on racial equity. So in June, as an organization, we launched a $50 million racial equity philanthropic fund to set about the work of doing two things. One, to transform the field of social innovation, to make sure it was centering racial equity more fully. And secondly, to ensure that in this moment where we all have heightened awareness of and attention to structural inequities, that we translate that awareness into sustained action and attention. So for us, that means we're investing over the next 3 years in up to 500 BIPOC leaders, getting them in the game to drive change. It also means mobilizing a lot of next-gen voices. There's stunning talent on HBCU campuses, historically Latino-serving organizations, Indigenous-serving institutions, community colleges, where the vast majority of folks of color in this country are educated. We got to get to them, upskill them to be the social change agents that we know they are as proximate community members. And then last but not least, sort of interrogating this question of what does true allyship look like for racial equity? It cannot be a meaningless slogan. What does it mean for people to show up across race, generation, class to do this work? So we've set a big, hairy, audacious goal for ourselves around racial equity for the next 3 years, but it is the most important work that we're going to do.
And if people want to learn more, they can learn a little bit more about from the report that you just released. You want to say a word about that?
Oh, Kai, thank you for that. We're proud of the work that Echoing Green did in partnership with the Bridgeband Group, where we try to articulate and shine a light on the depth of racial inequities in philanthropic funding. And in a weird sort of way, we had the natural and perfect sample set to do that research. For those who don't know Echoing Green, we're an early stage funder of emerging social entrepreneurs. We get like 3,500 social business plans a year, 160 countries around the world. We select less than 1% of those who apply. It is a rigorous, if not downright Darwinian vetting process. So the folks who make it through, we can't fund all the wonderful leaders out in the world, but the folks that we fund are best in class leaders at what they do. But what we were able to show through our research was those folks of color, Black leaders in particular, in our network were raising significantly less money than their white counterparts, right? And even if you controlled for pedigree, background, it just didn't matter. And the depth of the inequity was even worse when you looked at unrestricted net assets that Black leaders had for their organizations versus their white counterparts. And I think the fundamental lesson in Red Flag was that's a proxy for lack of trust in leaders who look like us. And so it was a real clarion call that we have a moment, if we're going to back folks who look like us, that we've got to change how this capital flows, to whom, how much, and what does it go for. So I think the research helped sort of expand the conversation that all of us are having in this moment.
I think that is so true. There are so many of us who know that implicitly, right? This is our lived experience, but it's very different when you're able to look at the data in, a pretty objective way and to show what's happening to these entrepreneurs of color and to hold people accountable, people who say that they are data-driven, people who say that they have a commitment to making change. Here it is on a piece of paper. What are we going to do about it together? Emma, what about Next 100? How has the pandemic and the racial reckoning impacted your work?
Yeah, I kind of want to go off on Cheryl's trust point for a moment,
Go for it.
Just to make the point. A lot of what goes wrong in policy is you have people who don't trust the people they are meant to be supporting, making the decisions, not believing what's going to happen at the end of the line. And that's about people of color, but it's also sort of far broader point about why lived experience matters in those decisions, in those positions. I think on the data point, Kaya, the one thing I would add, it's, and Cheryl sort of alluded to this, but one thing that has been, we all know, and we've all seen what's happened, right? Both the impact of the pandemic, the downstream impact of the policy decisions we made to try and manage the pandemic, from closing schools to closing businesses, and the impact of our mitigation efforts to help that pandemic, to help us, right? Whether it's vaccination efforts to unemployment insurance, at every stage of the way, we have seen the racial impact of these things, and we've seen substantial disparities. And that's horrific and not surprising. But in an interesting way, I do think those racial disparities have been so substantial that for a set of people who have been saying for decades, this isn't about race, it's about poverty, it's become impossible for them to ignore that through those three stages. And I think that is horrible, but also, helpful in some way to having this conversation in a more honest way. At Next 100, I'd say sort of two things about how this impacted our work. Our team is predominantly people of color who are predominantly working on issues of their communities that are issues that impact people of color, as well as some of the other specific hardest hit communities. We heard from Rosario. Undocumented immigrants have disproportionately been on the front lines throughout COVID. They have been left out of federal relief efforts. So have their citizen spouses and family members. Mixed status families have been left out. So she has transitioned some of her work on that. Another one of our policy entrepreneurs, Isabel Coronado, does a lot of work with Native communities who have also been amongst the hardest hit, thinking about what the right relief efforts are and the right ways to build trust there. So we have a couple of folks, and this goes to sort of taking the moment. One of our observations as people who are trying to work on policy is this activism is amazing. This activism is great. And how do we think about turning it into actual sticky policy change? And that doesn't mean we'll win all the things in this moment, but it has to mean we win some of the things in this moment. And how do we be a part of taking the energy around the Black Lives Matter paintings and turning that into something that really translates through to people? So a couple of our policy entrepreneurs really took on that type of work as well. The second way I just say our work transitioned, which is really a learning experience for us, beyond sort of individuals changing their work, is it's really highlighted the importance of having people with lived experience deeply integrated into the policy process from the start. Government does big things at moments of crisis. That's how it works, right? We spent trillions on federal relief efforts. We don't do that. We're probably about to spend another trillion. We don't do that. These big moments lead to big responses, which lead to big opportunities and, frankly, big mistakes. And in part, that's because these moments of crisis, policymakers become, and I've done this, more heads down, less likely to talk to people they don't know, scared about new solutions. And all of those have massive implications for the equity and effectiveness of the ideas they put out there. At this moment when it's more important than ever to get it right. I think there's a million examples of this over the past year. I'm going to pick for 1 second on the Paycheck Protection Program because it actually played out nationally. Systematically left out small Black business owners, right? And people of color disproportionately. We now have a ton of data on their inability to access PPP, which was, our governmental effort to support businesses and employees across the country. People of color disproportionately couldn't access. Black businesses disproportionately closed during COVID. That was in part for very knowable reasons, right? PPP relied on things like existing banking relationships that people didn't have. And Black business owners could have said that at the beginning. This is not going to work for us. Members of Congress and their staff, folks at the SBA, didn't identify that as a challenge. And this isn't even about the big policy idea, right? Which you can debate the pros and cons of PPP broadly. But this is about the strengths and weaknesses of its design down the road and what it would have meant to have different people in the room at the moment of crisis to think about how this can actually work. For us, one of the lessons is crisis policy happens quickly or not at all, right? You either get your moment or you don't, and you got to be ready. You got to have the right people ready with the right ideas. And otherwise, it's going to be really hard to make that up on the back end from the outside.
That's a great example about how centering the voices of the people closest to the problem in the policy moment is really important, is crucial, can make or break things. And in fact, I think we're finally having regular conversation about what we're now calling participatory practices, how we incorporate the voices of these people into not just the policy, but at every stage, right? So from research and evaluation, from grant making, policy making, and advocacy, to operationalizing things, right? We look at the disproportionate vaccine rates, and the fact that, and access to vaccine, you plop a vaccine clinic down in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, but you don't actually, but the way you get an appointment is online, when these abuelas and abuelitos don't have actually internet access, or they don't, like, this is not, we need to, I guess I want to understand, where else besides in the policy realm do we have examples, either positive or negative, during this crisis, about how centering or not centering the people closest to the problem have shown up for us. Cheryl, what have you seen?
No, it's such an important conversation. And Emma, I so loved your example about the PPP program, right? And, you know, I sort of watched sort of the first and second tranches go out, and sort of reminding again, when you don't center the disproportionately impacted communities, or something like 60% of African Americans are employed by small businesses, right? Our work, the nonprofit sector, makes up like 11% of the workforce, like 6 or 7% of the GDP. If you wanted to get to communities of color in this moment, if you had structured that program differently and thought about it, the outcomes would have been so different. And even though when you look at some of the data coming out, that once the federal government recognized how structurally inequitable it was, it made steps to sort of course correct. And by the end, you saw some parity around white folks getting these loans and Black folks. But it was too late, right? So if it was so existential in the early days, those businesses were gone, right? So again, you just see the gut punches happening again and again and again. And I just think that was such a powerful example that you raised, Emma, and that you talked about, Kaya. And again, I think you all make such an important point. I sort of navigate mostly in the world of philanthropy, given what I do. And you hear time and time again, and you appreciate it in terms of like good impact hygiene, but you'll hear philanthropy talk about, you know, like, we've got to select grantees whose programs and activities help us achieve our goals. That we need to rethink that, right? Their job is to help us achieve our goals, right? Mm-hmm. And that the shifting seating of power that, you know, we all have lived this for far too long. And until we think about that stakeholder piece, and both of you are absolutely right, it's exhausting, it's hard, it's messy. We all like stability. Nobody wants to do that work because we're just trying to get through the day, but it's the work. It's absolutely the work. So sort of shifting these norms and these standard operating procedures that have sort of built a philanthropic industrial complex, we got to shift them.
There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it's messier. It means that you have to come out of your comfort zone. It means you might not have the data the way you like it or what have you, but the results are going to be much more impactful. The results are going to be much more sustainable and long lasting. And that's a lesson that we've got to learn. So as we begin to wrap this conversation up, I want to circle back on this trust thing, because we say we want to incorporate voices. We say we want to trust our constituents or the people close. We say we want to co-create. And time again, we see things like what happened in Philadelphia, where they didn't trust Black doctors who were connected to the community, who were working in churches, and instead gave the vaccination operations to a group of young people who did not have a connection to the community or who didn't have medical experience and whatever. So you are talking to now hundreds upon hundreds of people who are committed. This is no city limits. These are the people. These are our people. So what do you want them to walk away with that is going to remind them not to make this same trust mistake again? What are the practices that you need them to incorporate in their work, whether it's grant making or policy or operations, or, you know, what do we want to tell our elected officials, that is going to help them center the voices of the most marginalized and the most affected in the decision making? What are you telling this audience? Emma?
Yeah, I mean, just do it. I get it's risky. You know, I think that I'm going to build a little bit on Cheryl's point about funders to kick this off. You know, funders make decisions every day about what counts and what doesn't, and what's valued and what isn't, and what's expertise and what isn't. And I'm going to talk about expertise for a second, because to me, it's part of the trust thing. There's a million people already in these conversations, right? In the political realm, nobody goes fast. Everybody has to go together with some set of coalition stakeholders. The question is, who are those people and what do they bring into the room and the conversation, right? You're not getting work done by yourself in policy. That's not a thing. And so who are you going to choose to listen to? Are you going to only choose to listen to academic expertise or former consulting expertise or data expertise? Those things all have value. They're already in a lot of rooms, so don't worry about that. How are you going to trust the additional expertise that's missing of the people on the ground who are going to live this? You don't have to kick everybody else out of the room, but you have to think about how you let these people in the room. And the thing I'd say from a practice perspective is that part's hard too. It's really easy to say, well, I just want everybody to bring people with lived experience and diversity into every conversation. And that's not how it works, right? We have centuries of systematically excluding people from conversations, of government not translating things, not going into communities, not building this trust, which is a lot of what we're seeing play out now. And if you want to do this, you have to do it seriously, and you have to do it at every stage of the process, right? You need to meet people where they are geographically, socially, linguistically, enough with the acronyms. You need to meet people where they are analytically. Everyone doesn't have to be a policy expert in my world, but they have to get a chance to understand and be able to explain the real challenges they're facing and the implications. I think you need to do this at every stage of the process, and I think it's something Cheryl's talked about, but this is not about you have an agenda and you take it to a community and you say, isn't this great? Do you want to stand up here with me and announce it at the press conference, which we see increasingly. This is about starting at the beginning. This is about what Rosario did in her project. It's about starting with families, about their vision, about the challenges they face, about the solutions they've seen in their communities that work, and building from there. You know, we see a lot, it's about like making sure you're not identifying the wrong problem. Kaya, you'll appreciate this, right? But if we look at kids and education during the pandemic, first of all, a lot to be said there about what we're really seeing about trust and families of color trust in the school system and the school system's trust in them. But without going down that rabbit hole, I just say we have a set of challenges we don't know what the right issue is to solve here. Should we be trying to convince families of color that reopening schools is safe? Should we be just figuring out how to fix remote instruction because we're in this space for a while? Should we be getting at the underlying lack of trust issues that are actually creating the situation we are in with families? We need to talk to them to figure out which of those things are most likely to give kids the experience they need for the next 3 months and then the next 5 years. And that's something we can't do by ourselves with the science and the data, which is like something I think we've tried very hard to do.
And we have to recognize that families are not monolithic, and we can do hard things. So we can create multiple solutions to meet families, whether they want to come back or whether they want to stay home.
And we can only do hard things if we acknowledge they are hard things, right? Like we can only do hard things if we acknowledge there might need to be 4 paths and plan for 4 paths at this moment.
That's right.
And Absolutely. In a lot of spaces, I feel like that's something we're missing and would be harder to miss if we had those families explaining to us, no, you need to do 4 things, right? And so that is what I would say there.
Super.
Cheryl, take over.
No, the last thing I will say, I was a historian of science in college and was actually fairly obsessed with global pandemics, weirdly enough, and sort of the preeminent historian on this work, Frank Snowden, who talks about pandemics as simply amplifying the structural inequities that have always been there, right? And all of these moments across time lead us to a fork in the road, right? And there are opportunities that we can pursue, or we sort of devolve to the worst of ourselves. And we've seen examples of what has happened when we take either of those paths as human beings. So we have a real moment to reset, reimagine, rebuild. And for us in the United States in particular, that work runs straight through sort of a critical conversation and analysis around race. And I'm probably speaking directly now to sort of the funders joining us for this discussion. And we like to think so much about sort of professionalizing the industry of philanthropy, but it is very much still an industry that is driven by personal networks, relationships, opaque decision making that doesn't lead us to optimize outcomes. If we want to get this right, we got to do a couple of things. We got to deal with our implicit and explicit biases, right? We've got to have a race-informed investment approach as we all move forward together to take on these structural inequities. We got to start to be in conversation and relationship with folks that are different from us. Kai, you said it's messy, it's hard, but we got to do it. And then we've got to start to pursue relationships out of our comfort zones. It's a very human approach, but it is the only way forward.
I want to say, ladies, we could keep on talking because there are so many more dimensions to explore in this. But I think at the end of the day, you all were great examples and gave great examples of what it looks like when we center the people closest to the problem as part of the decision-making apparatus. And I think each of us will continue to crusade for this in our work. It's what Robin Hood crusades for. It's the way we do our work. And so I just want to say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. A real honor.
Thank you.